Good afternoon there, or good evening, depending on where you're listening from. This is Michael Cross here with another exciting edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. This is a show where, well, we try to deal with things that the mainstream media tends to ignore or cover up, or questions that just aren't answered. You know, when it comes to propaganda, it's not just what is said and how it's said, it's often what's not said. That's the most important message that people need to dig into. Now, today, well, it has nothing to do, today's topic has nothing to do with Oregon just now legalizing marijuana. Yeah, you can go to Oregon and use marijuana and so forth. And, you know, Oregon's always had this reputation, well, not always, at least since the 1960s, as being this really open, kind of hippie-ish area of the country. Of course, that's not totally deserved. What happened was that many people who flocked to Oregon because the universities had a reputation for being more liberal, they stayed, and, you know, this process grew, and Oregon wound up, instead of being a kind of establishment Republican state, turned into a Democratic state. But before I go into all the politics and so forth involved with that, in fact, I don't even really want to deal with that, and I don't want to even deal with the marijuana issue. What I want to deal with is the question, and it might be a surprising question, but a question, let's just frame it this way. Were the hippies right? That's right. You know, were the hippies actually right in their philosophy and the way that they wanted to live life in general? Well, let's explore that and contrast it with where we are at today as a culture, society, even as a country. Now, there was one radio show host who, you know, a very conservative woman, who once said that the way to measure a religion is what would be the quality of life if everyone in that country had that religion. I think that's a fair question, really, because, for instance, the Shakers of the 1800s, they believed that celibacy was the way to get closer to God. Well, there are no more Shakers anymore. The only reason they survived into the 21st century was because they adopted some kids and raised them in the faith. But the last Shakers died, it was quite some time ago. And so obviously a religion like Shakerism wouldn't work. But then again, we could look at philosophies like materialism connected to consumerism. Well, we kind of see that we might look at Western society today and think, wow, we have this really wonderful standard of living. Our kids run around with iPhones, and we have this goodie and that one, and, you know, things must be really good. But at the same time, we have a marriage rate that has declined to, you know, record low levels, a birth rate, especially amongst the middle class, that has plummeted. And in fact, neither the middle class of Canada or America, or for that matter, the entire population of Europe, none of them are above replacement. If you didn't have immigration, they'd be dying off. I mean, I read recently that if we just look at, you know, racially, that in America there's more whites dying than are being born. I bring that up because if we take a look at the middle class, it tends to be mostly white. So if you look at, I'm sure if you took a look at, well, I've actually read that the birth rate amongst middle class black Americans is lower than that of middle class white Americans. Something then is not good if a culture is actually, if you just left it alone and you didn't have other cultures that had different mindsets that still had babies, if you didn't have them moving in and providing the workers of the future, then Western society would just collapse. It would die. So ultimately, what would happen if we adopted many of the views that the hippies had? Now, again, I'm not saying that, there's a prejudice that all the hippies lived out in nature in tents and smoked weed and, did LSD and stuff like that. That's not entirely true. I'm from Oregon. I've talked to many hippies. Okay, I get along with them pretty good. And they come in all shapes and sizes. Well, I've actually never run into an obese hippie. Strangely enough, they all seem to be really, really healthy, which I always wondered, if they're living these lifestyles that everyone thinks they live, how come they're in such good shape? And many of them look very youthful. They might be in their 50s and 60s, and you're like, whoa, I thought you were like 35 or 40. Well, let's take a look at what seems to be what they said and basically how that could apply to today's society. Now, again, I grew up during a time period that I was around. I saw hippies all the time and even had a chance to interact with them at a very young age, even though I was definitely not someone that, connected to the lifestyle that much. And the reason is because I'm from the Eugene Springfield area, and I was always kind of precocious, even as a little kid, 5, 6, 7 years of age. I liked, these TV shows like Star Trek and Dark Shadows and Norman Lear comedies, Woody Allen movies and stuff like that. I really got into that. I liked that. And I like to read too. Now, even though my family was working class oriented, and so forth. My dad worked in a lumber mill. We had a little bit of land, and my parents liked to raise, they liked to raise things. They came from that kind of background initially. And so they liked to raise chickens and vegetables, and I don't mean just a little garden, I mean a huge garden. It's like a half an acre that they had planted every year. And they like to do it pretty much organically, with a very minimal amount of artificial stuff. I still remember they would go, and it sounds kind of disgusting, but they would go and purchase this treated sewage that was turned into fertilizer. And organic farmers could purchase that, just like many farmers nowadays for strawberry fields will purchase tons of the waste from horse stables and stuff and use it on their land. I mean, that's natural fertilizer and stuff. But anyway, just going beyond that, I'm not going to get into horticulture issues. My family went and they like to sell this kind of stuff to the local hippie store. Yeah, we had one. Actually, it was fairly large. It's not there anymore, unfortunately. But it was a hippie store where people could go in and buy vegetables and eggs, honey, and all these kinds of items that were organic, which no pesticide was used. And, well, in those days, they didn't have GMOs. But essentially, the things were raised from the land itself, from organic, non-corporate sources. And they'd sell this stuff at the market, and I would go with them. And sometimes my parents would pick up reading material, and I would read that. I still remember reading this. Oh, they had this big journal. What was it called? The Whole Earth Catalog. And I found it very interesting, along with a lot of other publications. And essentially, it was about living a natural, sustainable, and I don't mean sustainability in like the Agenda 21 sort of definition. I mean sustainability where farmers in the old days, like in Germany, they'd take all the soot from the fires that they would burn to keep warm in the winter, and they would spread it on the land. They'd also rotate their crops. At least up until recent years, it was the farmer had a connection to the land. And then he would pass it on to his son or sons, and then they would pass it on to, and so on and so forth. So you had this kind of sense of let's just keep things going. And so then you did have to employ a lot of stuff that's not so much employed nowadays. So anyway, they'd pick up these catalogs, I would read them and so forth, and I found them interesting, even though I kind of still looked at these people with the long hair and stuff like that as being kind of weird. Well, now let's cut, though, to the messages. And I don't mean the stuff you see in the movies, because I really think that to a degree, the whole hippie movement that existed from the late 60s to the mid-70s, that was when it was highest. There's still hippies today, but when it was big culturally, was co-opted and maybe even destroyed by Hollywood. Because you got a message that was out there. That was, okay, this is what hippies are, they're kind of like these airheady people who are just into drugs and maybe not showering and stuff like that. And even nowadays, I remember my daughter and I were watching the remake of Dark Shadows, the Tim Burton one. And the hippies there that Barnabas Collins was sitting at the campfire with, they're all kind of like, yeah, love, man, and all this kind of stuff. And it just seemed like they were all like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, and that made it kind of look a little bit unattractive to the population at large. I do remember that the people that were my age, once the late 70s came, they might have had older brothers and sisters who were into that kind of hippie movement, but they were like, I want nothing to do with this. Because it had turned into a situation in which, well, there was a stereotype. And it was kind of a negative stereotype. So anyway, the thing is, I think that film kind of turned people away from it. We can also mention such things as the fact that, this gets into conspiracy theory, but, if you take a look, the only thing you have to do is Google LSD and the CIA and the counterculture movement. And you may be surprised, because when I first heard about these connections, I was like, whoa, now wait a minute. It's just another one of those CIA creates earthquake in remote region, or, those kinds of things. Everyone blames it for everything. Got athlete's foot, it must be the CIA. Well, actually, if you look into it, there was a connection. But that's a totally different story here. But still, there was a connection there. Some people feel that drugs were used by the U.S. government, promoted, and so forth, so that the counterculture movement would be destroyed and discredited. Because, the counterculture movement was actually asking people to question authority. And while it may have in some ways been a little overboard in some respects, it was doing something that had not been done in the 1950s by these people's parents. And that, in the 50s, it was sort of a, hey, things are good, don't question it. Let's just go along with it. And there was a certain narrow band of, right wing, left wing, you kind of stayed in the center, and everything was good. Okay, and there were people that, of course, questioned it, but they were like these really fringe people. And, of course, you had the McCarthy era and that sort of thing, where people were a little bit more afraid to express an opinion that might be negative to the government, because then people might say, oh, you're one of those right-wing, or you're one of those communist agitators, or something like that. But in the 60s, they were questioning the whole premise of foreign policy, consumerism, and all these other items. And, if you suddenly wound up with a society of people who were comfortable enough that they could question, in those days, if you had a high school degree, that was considered, wow, that's your ticket to success. And if you had a college degree, oh my gosh, you could take off a couple of years and go live on a commune or something. you knew that when you came back, that even with a liberal arts degree, you could get work. And in those days, one good job could support a family. So people were comfortable. And so they were more likely to be into the idea of social activism. Okay? That's not the way it is nowadays. Our standard of living in the United States has declined. I don't care, you say, yeah, but I got an iPhone here, and I got a flat screen TV, and I've got a great apartment. Well, you know what? At the same time, when your parents were your age, if you're a millennial, especially, or even a younger generation Y, your parents were living in a house, and they, with one income, and supporting a family. Whereas many millennials nowadays, with all their cool electronics and gaming and all this other stuff, are struggling to maintain an apartment in, an urban setting. So don't say, the thing is, our standard of living has declined. And if you're you're the kind of person who thinks, oh, well, there's always jobs out there. Well, you know what? That's not the case. And if there are, I just remember, and I brought this up on the previous show, I remember when I was in college, and tuitions weren't that high. I mean, I used to think they were kind of high, but they weren't that high. But when I was in college, I wanted to make sure I didn't have to take any student loans. So I worked part-time in a lumber mill for about 2 years, actually. And even though I was making good, I was making about $16 an hour. And I know someone today who was bragging on Facebook that he had just landed a job in which it was pretty much doing the same exact job I did when I was in college, doing this as part-time on the weekends. And he was making less than I made then. So if you're lucky enough to have a working class blue collar job, it's going to be paying less. And those jobs are either being sent overseas. Hey, TPP passed. Yay, gay marriage passed. Yay. Now you can go, you'll be able, when you lose your job because it's being outsourced, at least you can go with, if you're married and you're a gay marriage, and I'm not, whatever, you want to get married, fine. Go ahead. Go ahead and legalize polygamy. Okay, I'm very libertarian on that. But if you want, the state of the world, if you're celebrating Obama being such a great leader, well, the TPP, you may be going with your same-sex partner and signing up for food stamps together, because that's America today. Okay, let's not delude ourselves thinking, oh, things are so much better than they were then. Yeah, we have some more gadgets that we can play with, but if you look at things like significant life events, buying a home, getting a car, getting married, starting a family, those are all way down. Way down. Okay? And, of course people will say, well, we have a different type of society today. Sit back and analyze why. Okay? And that brings me to, another point here, and that was really what was behind the whole hippie movement. It was, to quote Benjamin Franklin, who said, the number one thing a patriot could do is question authority. The thing is, that's what the hippies did. They questioned authority. They looked at the dominant religions. They looked at the dominant government, the dominant corporations, and they started going, why? Why is it this way? And the thing is that, their answer was, it wasn't satisfying to them. Why should it be that you had dominance, when the government said something, and then the media would repeat it, and then people would have to, in many cases, like the Vietnam War, that was a life or death situation. I mean, when the government said, hey, we are going to go to war, if you weren't rich enough or able to get a deferment or something like that, you got drafted. Now, of course, the kids of the politicians and corporate leaders and those kind of kids, they didn't go to Vietnam. And you know why that was? Because they could sign up for college and stay in college for as long as it took, and then they could get special deferments, those sort of things. Vietnam was a working class, type of thing, where you may have a lot of guys coming from neighborhoods that were, traditionally Italian, Irish, working class, or, much of the West Coast and so forth, where your dads did work in mills and steel plants. Hey, remember remember when America used to make steel? Anyway, the thing is that those were the sons of those people were the ones that went and fought the war. And people started asking why that was. And the thing is that questioning defined what I consider the hippie era, to question authority. And much of what we see today with alternative media, much of what we see today when it comes to people just not trusting what they see on the national news shows, that is actually due to that era of the hippie movement that asked us all to question. Now, again, I do recognize that there are things that, like, I support people getting married and having families and so forth. Heck, I did a show even with, the whole thing about lesbians getting married and having kids. Family is very vital. Why? Because, biological reproduction is necessary for cultural survival, ultimately. The people that raise the kids are the ones who are determining the future. Okay? So I think it's very, very important. And I think to a certain degree, the hippie movement, a lot of the counterculture people, kind of veer away from hippie. Let's see, you try to use the word counterculture. A lot of the counterculture movement did get caught up with such things as population control. Now, I know that the U.S. government had a stake in promoting what many people would call feminism today. And I don't want to get bogged down in that because, there's so many different definitions of feminism. But it is interesting that the CIA was actually involved. Type it in, CIA and feminism was actually involved in this movement. And I can't help but think that also, since you had people like Henry Kissinger and others that were saying that population was such a huge issue in those days, that there wasn't a connection with promoting the idea of having less kids. I don't think there was anything really directly connected to the counterculture and having fewer children, but it may have just turned out because of the environmental aspect of it that people had less kids. Because I saw hippie families where the mom and dad had 5 or 6 kids, so it wasn't all a uniform thing. But I think it eventually crept in, and I just wonder sometimes how much of it was natural and how much of it was actually part of a bigger agenda from a bigger government. Because I don't think the government just sat there and said, oh my gosh, these people are doing all these things and, what are we to do? I think they took action. I think they try to divert people's attention into, different forms of consumerism and different types of social activism that actually took away from the root of creating a new way of living and instead turned it more political and therefore made it not so much of a way of living, but a way of thinking. And when it's a way of thinking rather than a way of living, then you're going to have a situation in which the people will just, eventually start gravitating towards the dominant culture, which is going to be consumeristic. Now, I will note on this population thing that we have not had a positive birth rate in the United States, and that's with everyone combined. We've not had a positive birth rate in the United States since 1973. Well, is that a coincidence? I don't think it had anything to do with abortion. Yes, that had something to do with it, but I do know that there are countries where abortion is illegal or has been made illegal, and it causes a little bit of a demographic blurb, where you'll have a little bit of growth and then it goes back down. People, making abortion illegal does not really have a huge effect on the birth rate overall. But in 1973, when, yes, abortion was legalized, in 1973, that was the last time Americans had enough children per woman to replace themselves. All right? And even though those people that were living in 1973 are still alive with us today, the people that were born in the 40s and 50s are still primarily with us today. It's just now they're starting to die off. And that is why, statistically, at least within the white population, I would also probably think that the Asian population, Chinese and Japanese Americans, you have to break that up there, that there's more dying than being born. I know that's the case for the Jewish population. There's more Jewish people in America, at least, who are elderly and dying than are actually being born today. I mean, this is something I don't think most people consider. They just think, oh, we're growing in numbers. Well, most of it's due to immigration. And, that temp in the number of older people because of an increased longevity. So anyway, let's look at some of the things that we could learn from the hippie movement. One thing I think we could actually learn from these people is, well, when it comes to organics. Now, the thing is, I will say this. The food that you bought in the store, let's say you went to the local supermarket, just regular everyday supermarket, back in 1970, let's say, or even up to 1980 for that matter, was, compared to today, organic. That's right. That's what they called food back in 1970. I mean, yes, to be organic completely, if you want to be pure about this, that means no pesticides, no artificial fertilizers, and no, GMO. But again, we didn't have GMO back in that era. The thing is, though, that aside from the pesticide use, and that was chemical and you could wash it off, that was, the food you were getting was organic. Now, today, think about your food. Most people don't want to think about their food. Why? Because it's scary to do so. Even though there are a larger number of people doing so, thinking about it. Still, the vast majority of Americans like low-cost food. You give them the choice between eating a hamburger that the meat was raised, let's say free range, where the cattle could go out there and graze and stuff. I know, the U.S. government is kind of cracking down on that. They don't want so many ranchers out there, this whole Clive Bundy thing. If you study it, you'll see that there seems to be kind of a negativity towards the people that, do just let their cattle roam around, on BLM and stuff and eat and actually exercise while they're alive. But anyway, if you get that kind of meat does cost usually a little extra. Now, of course, you could buy meat that's been raised in factory farms, in which if you buy hamburger, those poor cows are given all kinds of hormone treatment. Heck, you think that these weightlifters that you see that look like bugs, they get hormones? Think about the hormones that they give to those cattle. Okay? And I'm not sure whether those hormones are like, I know when you cook with alcohol, they say that all the alcohol's burned off. I'm not totally convinced that when you cook meat that all those hormones go away. But anyway, if you talk about pigs, have you ever seen those cages they grow pigs in the factory farms, where they don't even, that pig has never seen its back end because it can't turn around? Think about that, and yeah, you're able to get cheaper meat because it's got a lot more fat marbled into it. Okay, I don't remember when I was a kid, I go to sometimes, foreign countries like China, and you order bacon. Oh my gosh, the bacon is mostly lean meat with a little bit of fat on the edges. And when I was a kid, I loved the fat. The thing is that nowadays you buy bacon, if it's just in the supermarket, and it's it's a lot of fat with a little bit of meat, kind of, a little vein of meat running through it or something. And is that healthy, to be eating all that fat? All right. I'm not even talking about the hormones and all the other things that you pump the cow with and then feed it food that's GMO, grains and stuff. And okay, you got to eat, but people should think about the whole aspect of, would it really, since we have such huge surpluses in agriculture that we pay farmers to get rid of food, do we really need all these giant factory farms? I know they're efficient, and I know it's hard for the small farms to compete with them. One of the things I actually do like about the European Union, I know it's socialist, but they do give enough subsidies to small farms because they want they know these farms have been in families for hundreds and hundreds of years. They sort of feel like this is part of their tradition. So many countries in Europe, they try to maintain the small farms. Whereas in America and countries that America has a dominance over, usually you wind up with factory farms and these big conglomerates go in and buy vast amounts of land, and they basically, the peasants that used to own the land now are workers on the land. If you're wondering why so many Hispanic people are trying to get to the United States out of Central America, most of these are not Mexicans. They come out of Central America. It's just when they go into Mexico, Mexico doesn't want them, so they're like, hey, just keep going north, buddy. The thing is, take a look at what what the organizations like the IMF and corporations have done to the farms that these people used to live on. Look it up. It's not hard to do. You may be surprised about the connection. Okay? Now, let's wonder what the TPP is going to do for that situation as we expand corporate control. Thank you, Obama, and thank you, Republican leadership, that you put on that leash that Obama has on you, and you jump up and down, roll over, and fetch the ball whenever you're asked to. Anyway, now, the thing is, I just wonder, though. I remember back in the 80s. I remember that people were in pretty good shape. It wasn't just when you watch a movie from the 80s that you saw people that were all good looking and thin and beautiful and all this kind of stuff in that respect. You saw people, I remember in the 80s that people, if you were overweight, it was sort of like you stuck out in the crowd. Okay? I remember my mom was overweight, and she was so self-conscious about it. And the thing was, she had a back injury. So it was difficult for her to actually get around and do the things that were necessary to lose weight. But the thing is that, that makes you cognizant of what is around you. And most of the time, you didn't see a lot of overweight people, especially not young ones. Didn't matter what race or even income levels. You didn't see very many overweight people. And I wonder if the food that we're eating today, it must have some sort of connection to it. Because I remember people chowed down back then in the 80s just as much as they do today, okay? There's no change really in eating habits. And yes, there is a change in the way that people work. Maybe people don't have jobs anymore that are as physically demanding, and so when they're still eating that working class sort of diet. But I do know that if you go to an organic food store in America, and they're gaining in popularity, I wonder why, you won't see as many people that are overweight. Okay? And I just wonder if there's something to that. Maybe the hippies were right about this. Maybe people should eat more natural. Maybe it's better that we try, even though it may not be totally possible, to get rid of all pesticides and all artificial fertilizers and stuff like that. Do we really need to be making, adding so much corn syrup and genetically manipulating plants to where they have pesticide-resistant genetics to them? But, if the bugs eat it, things happen to the bug. Bugs, their DNA essentially is not that much different than ours. If you're comparing life forms, I believe we're all from the same source, okay? God created humans and animals and all these other creatures. The DNA is not that radically different. So a lot of items that will kill a mosquito or a bumblebee or some worm that's eating the plants, well, we know there's a lot of items that would also not be so good for human beings. So just wonder if it's a good idea to be manipulating that stuff. Maybe we should try to go more organic. And also maybe a little bit less consumption oriented. Take a look at what's aimed at people nowadays. Eat this. Oh, look, our new hamburger. We add this much more sauce to it. We do this and this and this. America is becoming a country that actually seems to delight in its gluttony. Hey, remember this, the 7 deadly sins? I know it's not part of the Bible, but, people talk about the 7 deadly sins. It was originally 8 until the Catholic hierarchy was like, well, not sure about this one, and I think we know why. Gluttony was one of the, it was the 8 deadly sins. But gluttony was in there, and it was considered a sin, and they got rid of that one. And we seem to be a society that is taking gluttony to the extreme. People that come from Europe, maybe not with Great Britain, they're more like America, but you come from most European countries. You watch the looks on the people's faces that come from Europe, and they order something at a restaurant in America. I remember my wife one time. She'd spent a lot of time in America, but we went to a restaurant, and I said, well, why don't we just go ahead and order this calzone here, and then we'll use the leftovers for lunch tomorrow when we go to the coast. And she was kind of like, there's going to be leftovers? And I said, of course there's going to be leftovers. And, the portions come, and she's like, whoa, what is this? You order drinks, you order a soft drink at a restaurant, and you go, okay, I'll have the large. God, I'm really thirsty. And you have to use both hands to carry it to the table because it's so big. This is where we're going. And this is something the hippies were kind of against. They were against gluttony, and they were against overconsumption. All right? I don't think you should feel guilty for eating or wanting to eat good. But don't you think we're taking it a little bit too far nowadays? Now, another area that a lot of people don't really give credit to the hippies for, but maybe they should, is homeschooling. Yeah, that's right. A lot of the homeschooling movement came out of the 60s, and it was an idea that the corporations were going to be, you send your kids to school, the corporations are trying to teach a certain thing. And it's true. Public school in America was, to a large degree, created for the benefit of corporations, so that you would have people who would be able and clearly that you all like. That's for the upper class kids, when they go and go to their private academies. You ever notice that? It's kind of interesting that if you a high school in America that is in a upper class neighborhood, the kids, but let's say the kids are still going to public school. The rules are so much different. The attitude is so much different. The teachers are more like, there as facilitators of education for the kids. Often there's a more informal communication between students and teachers. And it's almost like a little bit more like a university setting. No, not completely, but there's a little bit more informality, and the rules are not usually so strict. By the way, the schools usually they don't have as many kids on Ritalin and stuff like that either. But the rules are not quite as harshly enforced. On the other hand, you can go right across the boundaries into the working class neighborhood, and they are really strict. Everything is strict, strict, strict. And maybe there is a different attitude on these kids in the working class neighborhood are being raised to plug into working class jobs, military, that sort of thing. That's where the military usually comes and recruits the kids, on campus. They'd have their tables there all the time. The upper class high schools, even if they allow military recruiters, are usually see more emphasis on ROTC and Air Force. And often the military isn't even allowed to come onto the campus to recruit. There is a caste system in America when it comes to schools. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. And it's not so much they spend more money on kids in richer areas, it is that there's a different mindset. Okay, from everyone. There's less authority being exercised in the upper class schools versus the working class schools. So anyway, the hippies were the ones who were like, I'm going to raise, many of them were like raising their kids and teaching their kids. I remember seeing many pictures, they're out there, their renovated buses, and they got their 4 or 5 kids sitting there, a lot of times out in the sun, with their shirts off, and if they're guys, and they're studying. Mom's giving them a science lesson or something like that. And it wasn't so much the Christian right that got into this idea of, hey, why don't we just teach our kids at home, when they got mad about, various secular things in school. The groundwork had really been set by the hippies, who had already said, dude, I'm going to raise my kid the way I want to raise my kid. Okay? So, let's just go ahead and do it that way. And then many of the Christian parents decide, yeah, let's go for it. Now, the other area though. Oh, by the way, I just want before I leave homeschooling, let's just consider that when you go to a homeschooling like convention in the Pacific Northwest or California, you're going to see people. You'll get your hardcore, Christian conservative types, but you'll also get academic types. I don't mean that they are separate from each other. I just mean there are some people that are not so concerned with religion, but they want their kids to advance academically. They want Mary to be in college when she's 16 type attitude, or they want their kids working on science projects and math that is normally, first year of college. They want them working on those when they're 14, when you still have this kind of idea of this awe about the beauty of those kinds of things and what you can do to manipulate the environment. So the thing is that you'll see this coming together. And again, it's not so much that they agree with each other, except in the area that they agree with what they don't like. All right? I mean, the hippie type person that's still around, or the academic, they're not so much concerned that the kids learn the 10 Commandments, for instance. But they are concerned with that their kids learn how to think for themselves. And that's, contrary to popular belief, that's what the Christians want too. They want their kids not to just be created. What was the name of that show? or video or whatever, Pink Floyd's The Wall or something. I just remember this, all these hammers marching in unison. And the thing is that the Christians don't want that. That may be what a lot of liberal people think they do, but they don't. Now, then we go into that whole idea of living in a sustainable world. Think about how unsustainable the consumer mindset of today is. Okay? I know people who have, for instance, they're married, they have large families, and they teach their kids gardening skills because they want their kids to learn how food is made. Okay? They want them to appreciate that. And when you have kids working out in your garden, they also start learning that plants are delicate. You put too many chemicals on them, they die. They don't get enough sunlight, they die. Or at least they don't produce as much. And this is a lesson that maybe is a good thing for kids to learn, obviously. But I also notice that these are the kind of people who they don't waste as much. They actually are a little bit more conserving. Now, the thing is, a lot of kids, of course, those kids probably have TVs or computers, and they know what other kids have, and often they'll complain. Why does all my friends have this, or why do all my friends do this? But the thing is that when they get older, they've learned to appreciate that stuff. A lot of times now, with our, one kid families or two, we wind up indulging the children. And that's actually, in Europe, for instance, that's actually been linked to why we have more type 2 diabetes. Because, if you're growing up in, let's say, a Mormon family of Sikh or a Utah, even if your dad has a really good job, you go to the store, you're not, there's still a food budget. And if there is some snacks to be bought, the consideration is that you're not going to buy a big old tub of ice cream for each kid. But if you only have one or two kids, yeah, sure, indulge them. Mom, I want this. And you say, no, you don't need that today. I want more. And then, mom's like, oh, I feel so guilty. I'll buy it. Yeah, just to make you shut up in the store. People are looking. And this creates some very bad health problems. This is why we do have the type 2 diabetes on the rise. And if we live with a mindset of sustainability, if for instance, I really hate to see people throw meat away. Have a bite off a chicken leg and then throw the rest away. There's just something that, I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian, but I do feel that we should respect the fact that what it took to get that chicken leg on the table. Okay? You had to raise the chicken. The chicken had to go through a pretty miserable experience, dying, to put that chicken leg on the table. And then what? You throw it away? Come on. That's going totally against sustainability. And I will note that many hippies eat meat. And they did eat meat. But the thing is that they usually did it in such a way that, you go and I still remember my parents, we'd go and buy a quarter of a cow at a local butcher shop where he bought the meat from a local farm. And when you did that, you learned how to make sure that all of it was used and all of it was used efficiently. And you also had a sense that, hey, this is not something that, this cow died for you to have it. So why waste it? That's part of sustainability. There's no need to waste. And that goes into the overindulgence too. I saw a calculation. I wish I had it in front of me. I just thought of this. Someone did a calculation that how much people weighed in 1970 and how much they weigh today and how many what was it, a couple million barrels or gallons, I think it may have been gallons of gas per day that are used additionally to transport the extra weight from point A to point B. That's going against sustainability as well. If people are, see, I'm not into this camp that says, oh, we gotta get people to stop using cars, or have less kids, or live in little cubicles, and that sort of thing. I don't think we need to do that in the least. I just think that we could have more sustainability if people actually understood the concept of what it took to make the food they're eating and put it there and so forth. And that is something that maybe the hippie movement was right on. So not only were they right on organics, but they were also right on, don't overindulge. And, having a sustainable world. They were the ones, I still remember all these articles from these things when I was a kid about how to set up a little water wheel in a stream next to your house, for instance, if you're lucky enough to have that would generate enough electricity for your home. Or wind power, or solar, even though it was way less cost efficient in those days. They were thinking about this, like, why still have all this fossil fuel? You know what? We use more fossil fuel today per person than we did back in the hippie era. It wasn't, and I still remember when I was a kid, we're going to run out of gasoline by the time, the year 2000 comes. And now we still have plenty, and we have countries like India and China and stuff like that didn't have cars are now, most of the people are driving, or at least a huge percentage of them are driving. So the thing is, I think that ultimately, though, wouldn't it be better for the environment if we were a little bit more self-sufficient? And maybe it'd be even better for people if we were more self-sufficient when it comes to energy. Then you wouldn't have to worry about being left vulnerable in case of some sort of economic collapse. That, again, we see around the United States that there's this effort that the governments have of saying that, you can't have this windmill, or you can't do this or this or this because you're not part of the grid, the electrical grid of your community. So I don't know whether it's some sort of conspiracy or something, who knows, or a mindset. But if we lived in an era where people had free choice and could actually do these things, maybe we would, even zoning laws. Think about that. What an infringement. Yes, you can pay a ton of money for this house as long as you make sure that it's painted this way, the grass is kept this way, you can't fly an American flag, all this kind of stuff in these zoning laws. Talk about the opposite of freedom. Anyway, other things. How about, personal spirituality? I actually like this, and this is something a lot of people ignore, is that, yes, in the 1960s and early 70s, you had so many different religious cults. If you were charismatic, you could create your own little religious cult and do whatever you want. Still you could read about all these groups that would have free love, free sex, free this, free that. And they'd have some sort of charismatic leader who'd hold it all together, who knew how to use the English language in such a way that it was like, whoa, he is so deep, everything. But you know what? The thing is, it was good that people started questioning. Okay? This whole issue now with gay marriage, I noticed that some people brought up some stuff about polygamy. Oh no, now there's going to be polygamy, and it's going to be all horrible, and this shows the degradation of humanity, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. If it's a degradation of humanity, what about the fact that polygamy was practiced in the Bible? Oh, and you get some really weird, I don't care how you feel about polygamy, pro, con, whatever. The thing is, it was practiced by prophets in the Old Testament. But that's not usually something emphasized by today's preachers. In fact, today's preachers, I don't know what they really talk about nowadays. I mean, you look at stuff like, Christians being persecuted around the world, and I find more Jewish organizations that have tried to bring light to this issue than Christian ones. I mean, what's the message out there in modern Christianity? Get lots of money and feel good about Jesus and your nice sports car and your second, trophy wife and all of this kind of stuff. Is this the message? I mean, I would much rather hang out with a bunch of hippies at a hot spring talking about spirituality than, a bunch of people that were like comparing their designer clothes, and if you say anything kind of, a little bit controversial, they look at you kind of funny with that deer in the headlights look, and they're kind of like either, God will take care of it all, or what? I mean, I think that looks more cult-like from the 1960s than, the kind of thinking and pondering and exploration. I mean, I've read about a lot of intelligent women have been turning more to Wicca and paganism and that sort of thing. And I mean, I say, who can blame them? I mean, I'm not a pagan. There are things that is kind of cool about it. The nature aspects and the trying to ponder the meaning of the universe type stuff. I like that kind of way of thinking. I'm one of those, on the Jungian test, INTP or I kind of in between INTP and ENTP. So the E and the I factors almost cancel each other out in kind of a weird sort of way. But still, I like to think about things and ponder them. And, if you have a woman that goes to her religion, it's kind of like, feel good about Jesus and yay, Jesus, and, let's have some nice music, and the preacher gets up and gives a talk that's very similar to what you would hear on Oprah Winfrey anyway, except there's a lot more amens listed in it, contained in it, then I might be kind of inclined to start exploring some of these areas too. And I knew one lady, she was like a hardcore Christian fundamentalist, and she was really one of these really thinking type people, and she was involved in a lot of political stuff. And it really surprised me when I found out that she'd become a Wiccan. I mean, but come on. I mean, if Christianity is heading towards this sort of, let's just blend into society and be consumeristic as long as we believe in Jesus type attitude, and not worrying about, other social issues and what's going on in the world, just listen to the government, send your kids to school, sign them up for the military, that sort of thing. Now, I'll take the 60s stuff any day over that. Any day. Now, other areas that I think are really important here. Essentially, again, the one thing I'd kind of skipped over, I should have gone into this a little bit more, is that and why maybe we could have another hippie movement, except for one thing, and that is we don't have the comfortable setting anymore. People are scared to death of losing their jobs. They're scared to death of their kids not, they want their kids career focused right off the bat. Ironically, the kids are wasting, they're not as motivated to study as maybe kids in China, but still, everyone just kind of feels like, I got to work, I got to do this, I don't have time to be pondering this and this and this and contemplating the meaning of the universe and so forth. Oh, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you'll tune in next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Take care now.